My name is Jennifer Ritter-Guidry. I work at the Center for Louisiana Studies. The Center for Louisiana Studies, if you were not aware, is a research center here at UL Lafayette. We've been around for just over 40 years, and we have 3 divisions. We have our UL Press, which is the publishing arm of the university. We have our research division, which is headed up by John Sharp here, and that handles all of our archival collections as well as digitizing those collections to make them more readily accessible to all of you guys. And they also conduct field work to add to the collections. We also have a programming and special projects division, which handles all of our outreach and programming and wonderful events like this. And we will be continuing this Brown Bag Lunch series on the 3rd Friday of the month throughout the spring semester. And we'll have more information about that later. And guys, keep on coming in. This is great. I also want to thank AOC Community Media. They are out here filming today, and they are live streaming this also on their AOC's YouTube station. So if you have friends or family who couldn't make it out today, but are somewhere where they can, still consume the information, please direct them to AOC's YouTube channel for that as well. And we thank them very much for all of their support in this event as well as many others. So. Today, I would like to introduce all of you to Jessica Dauterive. I think a lot of you may already know her, either through her family relations or through her research. She is a Lafayette native, and she did her undergraduate and graduate work in New Orleans at UNO, where she studied both history and public history. She's currently at George Mason University, pursuing her doctoral degree in history, and she is on the job market. So, just so gotta put that out there, we gotta hustle as much as possible. But her, so her studies are in both history and public history, and her presentation today is a really wonderful meshing of those topics when we start talking about the Cajun Renaissance and the development of it. And I did ask her briefly why she chose this topic, and she said that it did stem in some part from research that she did here while she was working on her master's. So go UL special collections and archival collections through all of the other organizations here on campus. We're glad we trapped you in our web of fascinating, weird stuff. And we look forward to your continued research. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. All right. Thank you. Also, not going to turn it over to you, just real quick. Okay. Please check your cell phones, put them on silent vibrator off. We do have vending machines over here, and restrooms just down the hall there. So thank y'all so much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jennifer, for the introduction. And I just wanted to start off with a few thank yous of my own. It's good it's happening now. So first, I wanted to thank the Jamie and Thelma Gilbo UL Lafayette Research Collections Grant. It's a long one. For supporting my research. This has been kind of an invaluable 2 weeks to really get to dig into some collections. Like I said, I sort of discovered during my master's work and really got to explore in more depth these last 2 weeks. Also, the archivists and staff here have been really wonderful, both at the Center for Louisiana Studies and in the university archives here. And also to all of you for being here. It's the first time I've been able to sort of present my work at home, so I'm really looking forward to the questions and feedback that follow my talk today. First technical issue. So Fado Dough Instant Mix. As is the case with a lot of research projects, my focus and topic have shifted quite a bit since I submitted this title and sort of the prospectus of my work. I thought I'd sort of quickly start by talking about how I got to this point and then what my research has led me to in these last couple of weeks. So as Jennifer said, I grew up here in Lafayette. And so in a lot of ways, this is sort of a project of self-discovery, and it kind of makes it very exciting and a little more critical for me as I do this work. After doing my undergrad and graduate work at UNO and completing my master's in public history, I had done a thesis project on Swallow Records, which is a small, well, it was small, it's pretty large now for independent recording companies in Ville Platte, Louisiana, that's still more or less in operation today. Working here with Sandy Heimel at the Cajun and Creole Music Collection, I was able to sort of dig through the LP albums that Swallow produced throughout the 60s and 70s. And I sort of looked at the visual culture of the label through marketing materials, and sort of compared that to larger trends in the music industry at the time, but also sort of the aesthetics of Cajun Louisiana in that time as well. What I argued was that the sort of changing aesthetics tracked the Cajun Renaissance period as it was happening in the 1960s and 1970s, which I'm sure most of you know, but a resurgence of music, crafts, language, and foodways among Cajuns in Southwest Louisiana was very evident on the record covers, and also were something that then could be sort of shipped out internationally as a sort of definition of this is what Cajuns are becoming and this is who we've been. So in fact, Swallow Records is where this phrase Fado Dough Instant Mix comes from. Again, it's no longer the title of my dissertation, but I really love it, so I thought I'd use it today. So it comes from the liner notes to an album called Best of the Cajun Hits Volume 3, which was put out in 1978. And it sort of describes the Fado Dough. It says, "The Fado Dough, a Cajun dance held in a home, has given way to the small nightclubs throughout Acadiana that feature Cajun music on weekends, where friends and neighbors still get together to pass a good time. But this outstanding collection of Cajun songs and artists can be your Fado Dough Instant Mix. Just add a few good friends and neighbors, some ice-cold brew, then move the furniture back a bit, roll up the rug, and let the good times roll." So I kind of love this quote for the way it encapsulates a kind of modern Cajun identity in this moment. So it borrowed sort of from like the instant mix craze going on in food at the time, especially Cajun food, and also tried to educate the owner of the record, who was likely not of Cajun heritage, on the sort of particular life ways of Cajun people and how those two things intersected. And working through this project kind of got me thinking about what seemed at the time a contradiction to me, and what Ian McKay has coined commercial anti-modernism. He works on Nova Scotian tourism, which is kind of an interesting parallel. Not only does the term apply, but there's also a lot of shared history, obviously, between Nova Scotians and Louisianians and how we've sort of built our tourism industries. What he's getting at here, and what I'm really trying to explore as well, is how traditional lifeways intersect with and often appear as resistance to sort of larger social anxieties that come out of modernization, while also participating in those same systems. So how local labels like Swallow were able to draw from modern methods of recording and designing covers and distribution, while also promoting traditional music and aesthetics. So the Balfour Brothers album here, as many of you might be familiar with, represents sort of Swallow's first experiment with that aesthetic, sort of drawing a distinction between the earlier records like this Cajun Jamboree by Joe Bonsall and the Orange Playboys that sort of borrowed a lot from Western swing and from a more kind of fun-loving, popular identity. This was a shift for the label, and I would argue for Cajun aesthetics in general, towards a more documentary style and towards a style that really looked backwards as it looked forwards. And this idea of commercial anti-modernism is also where the 1930s to 1970s periodization comes from. So first I was interested in exploring how anxieties around the Great Depression in the 30s, so not just the sort of stock market crash, but the modernization of New Deal projects, so road building here in Louisiana, that was huge. Electrical infrastructure projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority really caused a lot of anxiety in rural communities and threatened to sort of erase local culture. And the response was to sort of search it out and document it. And so we get all of these WPA cultural projects. And it sort of struck me that the 70s felt like a similar moment as I was working. Again, the moment when Cajun revival sort of really took on itself in a new way. So not only did this post-World War II period culminate in the 70s with a long period of modernization and threats of cultural homogenization, but anxieties following civil rights gains, the assassination of national leaders, changing political spheres and parties, and changing feelings about politics, as you can see through things like the Watergate scandal, also created a lot of anxiety. And at least in Louisiana, it seemed to have sent young people inward to sort of mine their own culture as a tool to resist the homogenization and also reclaim a sense of community that might be lost through decades of social and cultural changes. So that Fado Dough Instant Mix idea, again, really recognizes and touches on all of that anxiety around tradition and modernity and social change in a playful way. And playfulness is something I really see as central to Cajun identity, especially as it sort of puts itself out into the world. So the inward search for identity is still a question that I'm exploring in a pretty broad sense, but my time at the archives has really refined it, both in scope and in period. So rather than starting in the 1930s, although I still kind of touch on it and allude to it, I begin my work right around 1955, which was the year of the Acadian bicentennial, marking the expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia. The anniversary in Louisiana was met with a year-long celebration across the state that centered around the figure of Evangeline, as you see here, and as was immortalized through Longfellow's poem, Evangeline. The celebrations in the state included a number of pageants, a folk festival, dedications of historic sites, and a pilgrimage back to Nova Scotia, sort of symbolically reversing the initial expulsion and connecting those two places physically, as well as sort of in an imagined shared history. However, it's worth noting that this wasn't the first time Evangeline played a major role in commemorating local heritage. So working in the university archives, I came across the scrapbook of Mildred Dessens, who's pictured here at the bottom. In the 1930s, politician and haddock salesman Dudley LeBlanc accompanied a group of women to Grand Pré, Nova Scotia to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the expulsion. So as you can see in this picture on the left, they're being greeted by President Hoover. So this was kind of a well-known national affair, and they made stops up the East Coast on their way to Canada, and their sashes each sort of unify them, but also have the names of the parishes from which they were selected to represent. And then at the bottom, you have Mildred Dessens, who was selected as the official Evangeline. So she was sort of the spokesperson of this heritage. And I'm very interested in this particular kind of Acadian identity. In many ways, this sort of genteel image of Evangeline and this sort of distant past defined Cajun identity throughout a lot of from the 1930s throughout this point in 1970s, where I find things kind of change. As the newspaper describes, they're dressed in Norman caps and kirtles, which are those petticoat dresses that they're wearing. And it provides a really different picture from this kind of rural, masculine, homegrown representation of Cajun identity that was used by Swallow Records, and we all are probably more familiar with today as sort of a dominant Cajun identity. And this transition is what I'm really trying to understand. So I'm a really visual person, so I kind of put this together for me, but I thought it might be helpful. This graphic shows kind of the shape my project has taken since working here. And I've been working on this, I should say, for about a year and a half now. So this represents what the dissertation project will eventually become when I start writing in the fall. So as I mentioned, I'm starting in 1955 with the Acadian bicentennial and ending with the first tribute to Cajun music in 1974, which becomes Festival Acadien. I've come to think of this period as kind of a prehistory or a prologue to the Cajun Renaissance, as we've known it since the 1970s. So within these two dates, I'm examining a number of people, movements, organizations that I see laying some of the groundwork for the 1970s revival and placing these moments within a larger social, political, and cultural context. And I alluded to those before, but I'll be a little more specific about this context now. So as scholar Shane Bernard notes, post-war Acadiana saw major demographic and economic shifts that were fueled in part by the oil industry and in part by programs like the GI Bill. This allowed for unprecedented modernization in Acadiana and suburbanization that came with new forms of leisure that were centered around radio, records, television, automobiles, all of those sort of trappings of 1950s era life. Modernization hit rural communities just as much. Bernard notes that farm households with electricity jumped from 15 to 42% in the 1950s, and roughly 80% of homes owned televisions by the end of the decade, a jump from about 1% at the beginning of the decade. So rapid change in a pretty small amount of time. This period also sees major changes in both grassroots and national politics. So you have increasing civil rights activity, both on the local level. So for instance, here in 1953, a court case led to the integration of what was then Southwestern Louisiana Institute, it's now ULL, just 1 year before the Supreme Court ruled on Brown v. Board. And local actions like these across the country sort of created this momentum for political gains at the national level. So the signing of the Civil Rights Act by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964, a decade later. Conversely, at the same time, the rise of a new conservative party manifested as a grassroots strategy strongest in suburban communities, as we're developing here and across the country, culminating in national campaigns for a new kind of Republican politics. For instance, the '64 presidential campaign for Barry Goldwater, whose states' rights platform was shaped as sort of reaction to the Civil Rights Act, spearheaded by Lyndon B. Johnson, received a lot of grassroots support in Louisiana, eventually winning the state, although he lost the federal election. And finally, the period saw major cultural changes. So the folk revival gained increasing momentum beginning in the 1950s, as did new genres like rock and roll, of which Cajuns were always a part, especially young Cajuns. New forms of media on the radio, albums, television grew in popularity, aided by the economic and demographic shifts that I noted before. And this was also coupled with new forms of public performance, like folk and later rock festivals, which will come into play a little bit later. So all of these demographic, political, cultural changes affected a community's sense of place and identity. And it also affected its sense of position within a larger national and even international context. And it's within this sort of environment of various levels and sort of various facets of social, cultural, political life that my dissertation explores, again, the prehistory of the Cajun revival. So as the press release stated, I examined the role of mass media on the Cajun revival. That's still a very big part of my project, although it's just now one part of my project. What I'm particularly interested in there is sort of how mass media entered homes and then Cajuns quickly found ways to adapt it to their own needs. So things like Swallow Records, which I've already discussed, but Cajun television shows, that's a clip in the top right from Aldous Roger's television show. And then on the bottom left, that's Revon Reed's radio show. So the importance of French language programming and the sort of effects that had on people to sort of balance the modernity and the traditional elements of their lives. Another part explores the relationship of an organization called the Southern Folk Cultural Revival Project. This was started by folk singers Anne Romaine and Bernice Reagan in the mid-1960s, and they used folk music performances to promote integration throughout the South. Fiddler and early Cajun ambassador Dewey Balfa not only performed at these events, but he served on its board of directors. And it was in this role that he established the successful educational program, the Acadiana Music and History Series. So the connections between this organization and Louisiana, people mainly through the influence of Dewey Balfa, offers a new model to think about Louisiana's role in the folk revival, not only sort of being part of it on a national level, but bringing it back home as well as how education started to fit into the Cajun revival. Right. And the third, so I'm happy to talk about these two more, but I want to focus on the Louisiana Folk Foundation today. Not only because it's sort of my main project at the moment, but the Center for Louisiana Studies recently acquired the Catherine Blanchette collection, which has allowed me to sort of piece this story together in a way that I wasn't able to do before, and it's an exciting story for me in the context of what I've been talking about. So this organization was founded after folklorist Ralph Renzler arrived in Louisiana in 1964. He's not in this image, but this is sort of the opening barbecue for the organization. He was working for the Newport Folk Foundation at the time, which was part of the Newport Folk Festival. The foundation was formed to sort of add more of a social justice and a sort of giving back agenda to the festival. After years, it kind of waned prior to 1964 when he arrived. So this was meant to sort of create a new mission statement and a reinvestment in local culture. And so it was on this trip that Renzler organized a Cajun band to perform at the upcoming folk festival. So this moment in '64 is often used to mark a sort of symbolic beginning of the revival. However, operating under the new foundation, Renzler was also tasked with a broader mission, which was, I quote, to use the festival's financial gains to keep folk music alive at its grassroots and for educating the public about folk culture and tradition. So the foundation had hired Renzler particularly to see these missions through. His mission in Louisiana, he also traveled to French Quebec, and he traveled to other places in Georgia. So this was just one part of this larger mission. But that mission was to locate traditional artists, prepare them for a Newport appearance, which he did, and which we know a lot about in the literature, but at the same time to pinpoint areas where Newport-sponsored local festivals might help to revitalize traditional cultures. Once arriving here, Rinsler was impressed to find that not only was there still a rich pool of vernacular musicians from which to draw and bring to the festival, but just as active a group of preservationists, politicians, and local boosters that were invested in a very similar mission. It quickly became apparent to him that these Cajuns would not just perform as subjects of an outsider's gaze, but active participants in the preservation and perpetuation of their own culture. So the LFF formed on July 18th, 1964, 1 week before the famed Cajun performance at Newport Folk, in an informal backyard barbecue that you see here at Comptroller Roy Terrio's house at the time. The LFF's first meeting, the group decided on a board of directors, and they established a large advisory committee that I didn't display, but includes like every person who was working on folklore at the time. It's kind of an amazing list of people. They drafted a mission statement as well that read, and I quote, "To preserve, revive interest in, and perpetuate the traditions and culture of the Acadians, who constitute the majority of the citizens in many areas of South Louisiana." So before discussing the work of the LFF under that mission statement, I want to bring your attention to 4 members of the organization who have the strongest influence on the story. There's a lot and it tends to get messy, so I'm going to focus on these 4 people today. So first is Ralph Rinsler. He's the national folklorist who was working for the Newport Folk Foundation at the time. He was here not only conducting his own field work, but sort of working as a liaison between the Newport Folk Foundation, NFF, and the Louisiana Folk Foundation, LFF. The second is Paul Tate, who was a lawyer in Mamou. He served as sort of Ralph Rinsler's first contact in the region, and was really kind of a community gatekeeper for him, introducing him to other people and getting him sort of involved in the culture, not only for his field work, but for this organization. He also opened Fred's Lounge, and he helped to reinstitute Mamou Mardi Gras around the same time as the Acadian Bicentennial. So he was already very much invested in sort of reviving Cajun tradition. And he served as the president of the LFF. Dr. Patricia Rickles was a English professor here since 1957, although she wasn't from the area. And she kind of represents a social progressive strand of folklore in the region. It was very much her mission by working with Cajun culture and particularly working with students here. And she served as the vice president of the LFF. And finally, Catherine Blanchette, again, whose collections are downstairs. She was a teacher and a preservationist. That's really where her folklore activities centered. She wrote Les Danserons in 1955 along with the Acadian Bicentennial, so it was sold at a lot of those events. And she was really very interested in sort of the old Acadian style of song and dance. So not the sort of Cajun Louisiana traditions that Paul Tate was reviving, but really looking backwards to the history of what we brought with us during the expulsion. And she served as the secretary of the LFF. And I should say that Blanchette practically ran this organization. In a letter to Rinsler, she actually declined the position of chairman, suggesting Paul Tate instead, because his work is, quote, better known among the people who run this sort of thing. But she also noted that, quote, a man can make things heard down here a lot easier than a woman can. And so she ends up as secretary, I think knowing that she'd have a lot of control over the organization, and she definitely had no problem making herself heard as the secretary. Most of the story I'm about to tell was pieced together through her writing, either in minutes or in correspondence between members of the organization. Okay, so after forming the committee and developing their mission statement, the group decided that this mission could best be served through a series of music contests at pre-existing local events such as Abbeville Dairy Day Festival, which Blanchette was involved with, Opelousas Yambilee, and the Mamou Mardi Gras, again drawing from Paul Tate's connections. The photos here, the one in the top left is from a festival in Basile, and then the other 3 are all from the Opelousas Yambilee. The one right here shows a panel of judges, and then the rest of them were either performing or winners after a performance in the top left there. So each competition was organized by the local planning committee of the festival, with the funding from LFF going only to cash prizes. The contestants would perform for a group of judges, again here at the bottom, pre-selected by the LFF, and it was suggested that at least one folklorist be included in each panel. The contestants had a particular set of rules, and I'm just going to read a few of them now. And it's worth noting, too, that Blanchette wrote this list, and she was drawing very much from her work in 1953 with Abbeville Dairy Day, and so these rules kind of mirror what she was also doing in 1953 with that same festival. So ground rules for Acadian music contests. The local committee will designate categories to be used, so things like rare, little-known songs, subdivided into love songs or ballads, drinking or comic songs, and children's songs. It's in capital letters. It is understood that it is the quality of the song and the traditional style of the singer rather than his vocal ability that is to be judged. So very much working in that preservationist mode of wanting to recover songs more than performance. Instrumental solos should be done on accordion and fiddle. Fiddle, accordion, triangle, guitar, spoons are all acceptable. However, groups using drums, electric instruments, saxophone, etc. will be disqualified. So again, very much a preservationist mission. Further down in the list, the Louisiana Folklore Society will make tape recordings of each contest for its archives at LSU. I haven't confirmed that those are there. Shaking your head now. But again, sort of this was meant as much a folklore venture as it was to sort of revive and give a space to local people to play. And reiterating the mission, the purpose behind these contests is to further the interest in and appreciation for Acadian culture. The contest may encourage the younger Acadians to learn some of their musical heritage from the lips of their fathers before it is forgotten beyond recall. So as these rules show, the organization served as more than just a sort of space for Cajun musics to perform, although it clearly was that, but rather a way to sort of define what was, and maybe more importantly, what wasn't Cajun traditional music at the time. Scholar Benjamin Filene uses the term cultural middlemen, which I think is kind of helpful for my work. He describes cultural outsiders like folklorists, record company executives, radio programmers, people like this who actively sort of made judgments about musical roots. They shaped ideas about what was authentic and what wasn't, and ultimately determined what folk singers performed. He's speaking about the 1930s and on, but I think that it's sort of an applicable category. However, I think these ground rules kind of demonstrate that Cajuns were happy to act as their own cultural middlemen, sort of creating their own boundaries around regional expression, what was traditional and what was not, and rewarding those who stayed within the boundaries, very explicitly in this case with the ribbons seen at the top left there. And again, all of the, most of the contestants, there were not that many, got some kind of cash prize. So it was sort of like a scaled level, but most people were compensated for appearing in this festival. So after a successful first year of these, the organization planned to continue the contests with the support of Rensler and the Newport Foundation. However, it was now 1965, and Rensler had become a bit uneasy with the nature of some of these contests and was worried that the local culture might be out of step with his own liberal politics. So in a letter to the foundation's lawyer, Elliot Hoffman, Rensler acknowledged that, quote, "The strength of the foundation is based on the fact that it draws from three important areas, including academics, politicians, and local people." But he also notes that this is also the source of one of its problems. So Rensler continues to Hoffman, the academics, by which he means Dr. Patricia Rickles and her husband, Dr. Milton Rickles, who is also part of this organization, quote, "are not Southerners and have no patience with the local attitude on segregation of the other members, although they find strong common interest musically and culturally." Rensler goes on to explain to the lawyer that these competitions are held, quote, "as adjuncts to already established local agricultural festivals like the Opelousas Yamblee, and that these festivals, quote, some of which by their nature have been segregated, have led to this issue that he's raising with the foundation's lawyer." In this instance, I don't think he was attempting to sort of excuse the segregation, but rather hoped to work within the cultural context of Cajun traditions and with the local people that he had formed bonds with to use the LFF as a tool of desegregation through these music contests. So Rensler raised this concern to Hoffman that the LFF, quote, "will disintegrate if we do not take a stand on the question of segregation at festivals which our endowment permits them to sponsor." So I think through conversations with Patricia Rickles, it was becoming clear that these sort of disagreements might tear the organization apart because they were just too different in political orientation. Rinsler insisted that Hoffman send a letter to the organization making a stand one way or the other. And so the very next day, Hoffman mailed a letter to Tate, Blanchette, and Rickles, again, reaffirming they're sort of the three who are spearheading this organization, outlining their demands. And I'll read a little bit from this too. Hoffman writes, however, because of the fact that our funds are derived almost entirely from the generous contributions of time and talent on the part of leading folk artists of all races, it is incumbent upon us to direct the attention of all recipients of our grants and aid to the firm policy of the Foundation that festivals presented with our sponsorship include a substantial and representative proportion of the music of both Negro and white artists. He goes on in the letter to continue, although we leave the methods for accomplishing this to your capable discretion, we might mention that one way to assure all-inclusive programming might be to add certain categories to your competition. We're confident you will understand and implement this requirement in all appropriate ways. So again, sort of giving them that opportunity to work within the cultural boundaries of the area, instituting perhaps a Creole and a Cajun category in these contests. And although this letter likely pleased Rickles, who seems to have tipped Rinsler off to these issues on the local level, it didn't sit well with other members of the LFF. I should say this is the first time since the LFF's founding that Rinsler seemed to assert Newport's role in these contests, not just sort of as the financial providers of the award money, but as middlemen, really attempting to shape the development of the local revival as an outsider. Unlike Rickles, Catherine Blanchette did not appreciate the implications of this letter, and she wrote a response in which she explained her position before ultimately offering the resignation of herself and her husband, who also served on the board. So I'll read from her letter as well. Let's see. Oh, no. Well, you get the gist, right? So she's basically, I seem to have oh, here we go. Okay. So the phraseology of the letter distressed us, and Paul Tate suggested the choice of words might not have the connotations that we read into them. Substantial and representative proportion sounds pretty much radical Yankee civil rights, telling us unreconstructed Southerners how to behave or else. She continues, I hope we are wrong in this interpretation, for I feel it is the end of Newport's work or influence here if we are right. Mrs. Rickles, however, tells us that you have spoken to her quite a bit and over a considerable period of time about that phase of things. And she offers a sort of her own opinion on the possibility of sort of using local festivals to integrate, saying that there are times and places where integrated folk music performances and contests might be feasible, as on the USL campus, again, Patricia Rickles' world. And there are times and places where it would be foolhardy, to put it mildly, as at some country town on Mardi Gras Day, when more than half the people are drunk or masked or both, and somebody said that Northerners are sending money in to force social integration. So she continues, and then eventually offers the resignation of herself and her husband, and asks that they be replaced to the satisfaction of those concerned. And I should say, I don't think she left. There's much less correspondence after this moment, but I don't think she left in bad blood. And I'll talk a little bit more about what happens to these people later. But she does leave the organization, and at this point, it has one more year, but it really seems to dissolve at this point. However, I want to sort of unpack what she said a little bit. Her point about forcing integration in an event like Mardi Gras showed Rinsler that his hope to work towards desegregation through local people at local events would likely not come to bear, at least not at that moment. Indeed, after this point, his influence in Louisiana, aside from his own field work, seemed to shift more solidly into academic and political circles. And while the suggestion of racial integration was clearly a catalyst for Blanchette's resignation, it also signals a sort of broader investment in the rhetoric of conservative politics in that moment, particularly around issues of states' rights. So the states' rights platform, whose Louisiana chapter was established as early as 1960, again, that was a charter that I found working here, recycled post-war and sort of anti-Reconstruction rhetoric, unreconstructed Southerners, Northerners coming in, those kinds of things. As a reaction to civil rights gains, growing programs since the New Deal, and her choice of words really falls right into this category. Even in previous letters, however, she makes her political alignment pretty clear. In one, when discussing what to do with that money, whether they were going to offer cash prizes or some kind of trophy or ribbon, she notes that The board can decide what's best. However, we're all for individual differences in states' rights in this family. And in another, she derides the federal government for instituting zip codes, using it as just one more symbol of the increasing federal overreach in local people's lives. So I think throughout her politics were very clear, and she saw this as sort of a vehicle for those views. Blanchette also appears to have worked directly with the Barry Goldwater campaign, again, who was sort of a figure of these kind of policies. And it was at its height during the LFF's first round of competitions. In a letter to Paul Tate, she notes that one of the contests even moved to the Goldwater headquarters. I feel like it was because of inclement weather, and there was a Goldwater headquarters nearby. But again, sort of explicitly fusing the cultural and the political through her perspective. And this certainly wouldn't have agreed with other social progressives in the organization like Rickles, who eventually tipped Renzler off to her unease with how the organization was developing. Goldwater lost the 1964 presidential election, despite winning Louisiana, along with his home state of Arizona, and then 4 other deep South states. And the resignation letter that this quote comes from was penned just 3 days after Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, and something that Goldwater supporters flatly rejected. And so I think it likely sharpened her rhetoric in that letter, although I think her politics were clear. And so after this point, go back to our 4. The official work of the LFF seems to have virtually dissolved, though its members continued to work in their separate ventures. So Blanchette grew to see the LFF as just one more sign of outsider influence in local affairs, and returned to her work in preservation, primarily through children's education and conducting field work. Again, a lot of that material is downstairs, and is pretty interesting to listen to. Tate's reaction to this is harder to gauge, although Renzler seemed to think that, quote, he is not involved with integration activities, but he is not out of sympathy with him. His letters also reveal a sympathy with Goldwater, but I think he was definitely less staunch one way or the other than Blanchette might have been, and he remained the president of the organization for at least one more round of competitions. Rickles continued to welcome the support of Renzler and fight for progressive change in the region, primarily through her role as a professor. She even had Renzler meet with the university's African-American student-led ambassadors club to organize a folk festival that would include an integrated local lineup, as well as the possibility of more popular folk acts through the Newport Folk Foundation collection like Joan Baez. Although this festival doesn't seem to have materialized as far as I can tell. And finally, Renzler also kept his eye on the region, becoming involved with the early development of Codafil and continuing to promote Cajun musicians both on and off the Newport stage. So thinking about this organization, finding in the archives, one, I was struck that I had never really heard of it before. And I think judged by its short life, it might sort of come across as either inconsequential or even a failure. However, I'd argue that it actually did very important work in the service of the Cajun revival, especially as it changed and morphed in the following decades. So first, it sort of brought this previously disparate group of local people together who all shared a mission of reviving local traditions, although they perhaps had different methods for doing so. The contest also seemed to have sparked an interest among local musicians to keep playing towards the promise of a national stage. Musicians like Issam Fontenot and Edem B. Desatel were both involved in the competitions. And as far as I can tell, there were some repeat performers as well, so they really enjoyed this space to show off their traditional chops. And finally, for what it's worth, the Newport Folk Foundation always quotes the Louisiana Folk Foundation as its most successful local project. I think it's also, especially this moment of sort of dissolving around integration, it's an instructive story. I think it reveals the varied and contested work of local preservation and sort of what happens when folklorists, activists, and politicians all have certain ideas about how a culture should progress into the future. It also shows how the folk revival played out on a local level, and that Cajun people were active participants as both performers and preservationists in their own right. And it reveals the fault lines and contests over local identity, showing that not only is Cajun identity sort of an ever-evolving idea that means many different things to different people, but that it was not created in a vacuum. So those who worked to shape it brought their own politics and their ideas to the movement about what's best and about how to move it into the future. Although all the members of the LFF agreed that Cajun traditions were worth preserving, the ways that they would be perpetuated, from the ground rules for the contest to possibilities for desegregation, were not inevitable. So Cajun identity then offers us another lens through which we can view how political, social, and cultural differences were negotiated in this time period. So the story of the LFF also does some narrative work for me, as the members of the organization came back together again in 1974, which is again the bookend of my project, to help organize the first tribute for Cajun music. Paul Tate again led the committee, which included both Rickles and Blanchette. Rinzler lent his organizational skill, and he wrote the script for that evening, while his new organizational affiliation, the Smithsonian, sponsored the event. Perhaps to avoid the local tension that came up with his work during the Louisiana Folk Foundation, the Smithsonian's sponsorship came with an upfront stipulation that they'd have final approval over the program for the night. And although some members like Blanchette still pushed for narrow definitions of Cajun music, arguing, quote, "You can't be very historic with contemporary musicians," the lineup eventually featured both traditional and more modern musicians in an attempt to represent the full range of musical expression in the region. Importantly, the set list for that night was an integrated one. And unlike the LFF song contests, the tribute sparked and became the flagship event for a new period of Cajun identity that prioritized more homegrown celebrations of cultural identity, relying less on the sort of symbols of old Acadia and more on traditions that were rooted in Acadiana itself. So as I hope I demonstrated here today, going from this to this was a sort of winding, contested process, and the LFF is just one of many stories I've sort of uncovered that complicate that history a little bit. And it's my hope that in continuing to recover those stories, we can understand a little bit more about how we got here and hopefully who we are. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions and feedback if anyone has any.
Did you have a chance to listen to any of the Dairy Day recordings? Because I know that some of those are in the center, and it strikes me that maybe those recordings were made as part of the effort you were talking about, but never made it to Baton Rouge.
As far as I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pet, those were from 1953. So they were done when she was working with song contests. It was her and Terrio who were working together, or Terrio. But a lot of that laid the groundwork for organizing these. So I don't think that, as far as I can tell, they're from this, but they definitely are sort of connected to this in terms of the kinds of music and song that would have been presented. Yeah.
I'm curious to know if any of the Beaufort family or some of the musicians featured here or present.
Oh.
Just curious. I was very fortunate when I taught 4th grade. Mr. Dewey Beaufort, through some organization, some grant, came and played, and he and Mr. Conrad Fontenot, who was an African American man, and I don't know if you have any information on that, but it was really a good program, whatever grant it was. Too old to remember.
I think that was this organization at the bottom, the Acadiana Music and History Series.
Probably.
So the Southern Folk Cultural Revival Project, again, had sort of an explicit mission to integrate through folk music, which Dewey saw as natural for this area. We're playing with people at Cannery Fontenot. And so they first funded that project, but then he eventually got funding through, I think, the Acadiana Arts Council and some other more state and local organizations to continue it.
Well, I'm not quite that old, but it was around the early 80s.
Yeah, this was late 70s, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting how you shed light through these kind of primary source letters, just on preservation. The idea of it's always going to be a little bit curated, and so it's always someone's idea of what. I mean, Miss Blanchette saying like we're going to measure these songs not by how they sound right now, but how they're attempting to sound to capture what these original Acadian songs were like. And I think it's just an interesting insight into. I mean, even now people are trying to measure what Cajun is, and I think you can kind of look back and and there's always gonna be different perspectives on what is and what isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's why instead of sort of focusing on the musicians or the craftspeople, I'm focusing more on these organizations and these individuals, because they did have a big influence on, who got to play and what spaces were available. But yeah, like you said, there's always a level of curation, and kind of as soon as you identify something, it changes, or at least the nature of how it would have been sort of authentically experienced becomes something different. So I kind of stray away from that language, but I think my hope is that, like, looking at these organizations sort of sheds light on how contested Cajun identity was, even just in that small period. Not in a negative way, but that it could provide different things for different people. And then I think it still does that today.
So you go into depth within kind of this little Venn diagram, each I guess each different focus you've identified.
Yeah. One thing that struck me about this periodization too is people like Blanchette, who was involved in the Acadian Bicentennial, remain involved throughout. So I can sort of track people through different organizations as they ebb and flow, but also how their ideas might change or not. But then also these organizations let me get at what's really important to me in developing this project is sort of placing Cajun identity in a larger context. So like working with a regional organization like the Southern Folk Cultural Revival Project or the Newport Folk Foundation, which was national, kind of lets you look at it in a bigger picture. I think we often talk about it in really hyper-local ways, which is important, but I want to kind of broaden that out. Again, like it wasn't in a vacuum, so people were very invested in these other ideas as they were also shaping identity, and I want to sort of understand better what that looked like. Yeah.
I had this observation. Ms. Blanchette was a native of Vermilion Parish. Roy Terrier was a former mayor of Abbeville, and the comptroller, which was a position likened to the treasurer, a statewide elected official. Dudley LeBlanc, known as Cousin Dudley, was a state senator from Vermilion Parish as well. Paul Tate was of Evangeline Parish. And so you note the importance of Vermilion and Evangeline parishes, two parishes where the actual speaking of French was preserved. These parishes were a bit more isolated than, for example, Lafayette Parish. What happened, and this is an observation I don't think people talk about too much. In Lafayette, people ceased to speak French earlier than in the rural parishes. That is to say, at least in the city. Not so much in Cairncrow or Eunice or Scott, but those areas were more likened to the rural parishes. But people ceased to speak French in the city a lot sooner than they did in the rural communities. And so you note the absence of any significant players from Lafayette, at least in that particular organization. Also, Dewey Bonfon was from Bazille in Evangeline Parish. So the major players, if you look, were from Vermilion and Evangeline Parish. That's not just a happenstance.
Yeah. No, that's a great insight. And one thing that kind of struck me going through the correspondence for just the Louisiana Folk Foundation was Paul Tate and Catherine Blanchette sort of introducing themselves to each other. And he notes that he starts to sort of describe his own work in preservation, and he says, in this part of the country, we've been doing this. So even between Mamou and Vermilion Parish, they weren't talking yet. So part of what I'm trying to do, exactly as you're saying, these disparate people coming into the same orbit and developing things together. Yeah.
It's not a comment on, and I applaud your project, but Cinema on the Bayou Festival starts next Wednesday, and it runs 8 days from Wednesday until Wednesday, and the closing film is done by Dr. Nathan Rabelais and his brother, and it's called Finding Cajun. So for those of you who may not be aware of that, that is a good something to catch, to not miss.
I'll unfortunately be back in Virginia by then, but I'll try to get my hands on it. Yeah.
We have a lot of graduate students here, yay. And so I was wondering if you could share some insight into how you structured your research
Mhm.
and how it's led you down different paths, perhaps some that you did not anticipate.
Yeah. Let's see. I'll start again with Swallow Records. When I came to look at, well, I guess I'll start by saying that I like doing radio and sort of media history, but there are very few records to draw that history from when you're looking especially at independent recording companies who were like on the fly trying to get stuff out. They weren't concerned about keeping records of that process. So when I came here to look at whatever Swallow Records material there was, Sandy pointed me to the LPs to start, and because it's an archive, preservation was important, so I couldn't actually play them. So I ended up, well, you would have helped me, but I wasn't actually going through and listening to the records because I didn't want to mess up the LPs. And so I was looking at the covers, and that actually was sort of like a first jolting insight where there's a lot more that I can say personally. I don't have a music background or a musicology background about sort of the cover art and the ways that that shaped an identity just as much as sort of the sounds on the record. So that was sort of my first moment where I kind of let the archives guide my project. Developing it out, I thought that I was just going to write about mass media. And I thought that I would do sort of a chapter on all of the different forms, radio, television. Again, there's a scarcity of records, and I'm now sort of lumping them together. But my strategy since realizing that was just to sort of dig. So I was lucky enough to get a fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill, and they have all of the gold band records collections there, which is like a major exception to that rule of scarcity. So I was able to dig around in that. And then because I had that sort of 2-week period to do research for them, that's how I stumbled upon the Southern Folk Cultural Revival Project, which I never would have looked at if I was just going to an archive. And that's opened up a huge new window into thinking about those sort of various levels. So I guess my point is just to say that I've really let the archives kind of guide this project. And it's given me this new periodization, and it's given me this new sort of way to trace people through. And it's still sort of surprising me in terms of like who I'm talking about and where Cajun identity shows up. So I would say that just explore and don't try to sort of confine your topic too early. Also don't get too big to where you're like swimming and stuff. But yeah, I'd say just be open to what the archives can show you.
Getting back to you looking at the album covers and the Dewey Alpha album cover, I was interested if you could deconstruct it for us and maybe articulate for us why you characterized it as looking back and looking forward. You know, the carriage, the Garçonniere, if you could kind of articulate more detail there of how you view that cover.
Yeah. I wish I had the back of it up, but so the back of the cover shows sort of the interior of the house, and it's got like cast iron pans hanging and sort of like what you think of as an old Acadian style house. Obviously, play traditional Cajun music sort of indicates that this isn't of the time, that they're referencing something that is past and they're bringing it forward. So in that way, I kind of see a commercial record different than a sort of folklore recording. So this was made to profit from. So like in that way, it's balancing modernity and tradition. But also, I just love on this record that they're like on this porch with the buggy, as you mentioned, but then they're wearing suits. Right? So, like, they're very clear that we're not living in this time. We're not trying to be characters.
Okay, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
So
We're not trying to, like, play. And some people do. Like, I think that there is a very performative element of this, too. But I think I really like this first go because it grounds the modernity of the musicians. You know this isn't a photograph from 1930 or whenever they're trying to emulate. But you know that it's referencing the past. So, yeah.
What was the date of release for that?
For this one, 64, 65, I think. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But I know that I interviewed Floyd Swallow for this project, and he wasn't keen on doing these kind of records. He told me until they performed at the Newport Folk Festival. So it was definitely after 1964. Yeah.
Going back to what Lester was saying about the surrounding communities, my mother's family was from Gaydon, and my father was from Scott. And I did notice that when grandparents would come to Lafayette to visit, everyone spoke English. But when I would spend weeks in this country, Gaydon, or go to visit relatives in Scott, mostly French was spoken. So that was a good observation. I didn't really think about it at the time.
Yeah.
But also, when we'd spend time in Gaydon, early in the mornings, there were morning shows that played French Cajun music every morning, and my grandmother would wake me up to listen to it.
Yeah.
Every morning at 5 o'clock.
And did you love it?
I didn't appreciate it back then.
Radio?
Yeah.
No, it was television.
Television?
Channel 10.
Oh,
Channel
nice.
One of the
Caleb
only
White?
ones
Mhm.
you could catch that was back in the country.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Anyway.
And is Swallow Records still open?
Yeah, they're still
Still operating?
they're still operating. They're not like producing in the way that they were, but yeah,
They still, okay.
they haven't shut down. Yeah.
They have a new
They do Flat Town Records.
Yes. That's
They
the
have what?
that's the umbrella corporation.
What is?
Flat Town Records.
So,
Okay.
so the Swallow Records, Jim Swallow, I'm from Gilpin.
Oh, thanks.
And I grew up on this, I was wondering, I see you said this came out, this album, the Bonfire Brothers, was in 64, is that what you said?
It was definitely after
67.
67. Thank you.
Because I see you play traditional Cajun music. And, I mean, I grew up with KDPI,
Hmm.
the music that that Swallow Records produced. Every morning at 7:30, every afternoon at 4:30, that was the news in French.
Mm.
They do that en français. And my parents, I didn't grow up calling it Cajun music. We grew up saying c'était la musique en français.
Mm.
It was French music, that's all it was. So, and it's not that I haven't asked myself this question before, but just seeing it on there, on that album cover, and seeing it as labeled, the Ballpark Brothers play traditional Cajun music, when did we start, calling it Cajun music? Because that's what everybody calls it now, that's what it's called. It's forgotten that it was French music. There wasn't that distinction made. And I don't know that that's something that you can answer. It's something that I need to find out myself.
Yeah, no, that's a question I asked too in this project. I guess first, what I'm trying to track too is like that process of becoming kind of like self-aware as a people. Like you're saying, like it wasn't like your grandmother would put it on because that's the music she wanted to listen
She
to.
called it French music.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's an element of it becoming popular in the folk revival and being profitable through the record industry and people being able to really sell it as a thing. And I think that self-awareness goes into having to catalog it as a certain thing. So Cajun became a designator for that French music that other people could understand as well.
Are you saying that was marketing?
Definitely. I think marketing and tourism industry, I think, had a huge part to play in all of this too.
Was it identified from the outside though? Was it, was the guy from Newport,
Rinsler?
Was it people such as he, who named it that? Just like Zydeco music was named anyway from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
The term Zydeco.
I mean,
don't
even
know the
as-
answer to that, I'm just throwing it
Yeah.
out there. I don't know. Barry Osselay maybe could shed some light on that.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, but I thought even as early as 1930s, when they would play on national stages, they would be called Cajun Band. They played the National Folk Festival. I'm getting my dates wrong, but I think it was around the 1930s, and they were called a Cajun Band. So I think definitely outside it was a designator. But also, I mean, it struck me as interesting that this was the Acadian. So before it became the Louisiana Folk Foundation, it was briefly the Acadian Folk Foundation. And I haven't found a letter to show exactly why they changed the name, but the contest was always the Acadian Song Contest. It was never sort of a Cajun contest. So I think it also depends on if you're looking at what kind of music you're looking at. So for preservationists, sort of French music or Acadian music seems to be a preferable term in this period, whereas Cajun sort of becomes a more marketable term. But that's still something I'm definitely exploring.
So you've talked a lot about music as one of the focuses of the LFF.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like in the comments we've talked a lot about language. And certainly the music is being performed in French. But was the LFF interested in preserving the language itself?
I think Blanchette was for sure. I don't know. And that again, I think goes to like what people's motives were for reviving the culture. So I think Patricia Rickles was looking for a more sort of participatory culture that would sort of move us forward. So I don't know if French was a necessity for that path for her. But as far as I can tell, I mean, the songs had to be sung in French. So in that capacity, yes. But I don't know, like none of their letters were in French. There wasn't any kind of like organizational push towards that. But the rules of the competition, I think it says it in there. Yeah, I'm almost positive that the rules of the competition were that any song that was sung would be sung in French. So in that way, they were definitely invested in the language as well.
He said the Balfour Brothers record wasn't made until after the Newport Festival, so this was too new back then? Is that why he didn't?
It was too
Too new? Was this too modern back then for him to accept it?
No, it was
Or
not modern
it wasn't
enough.
available?
He kind of cut his teeth in the industry on swamp pop, Cajun rock and roll. And so that's where you see these sort of Joe Bonsall covers that are trying to like bridge those two things. And the Western swing influence as well. So he was sort of afraid to put out traditional music because he was afraid it wouldn't sell. And so when the Balfour Brothers showed that people would buy and are interested in hearing this, then he started to produce more of that kind of music on Swallow. Not that the other records didn't have French music on it, but just that they weren't marketed in that same way.
It could have been named Cajun Music at its West.
Yeah. It's a missed opportunity. Yeah.
I'm from Ville Platte also, and Floyd's record shop was the place where I bought all my Beatles and etc. Records. But there is a museum, if any of you are interested, that may include some Cajun stuff, but definitely swamp pop. And in Ville Platte, it's pretty nice. Floyd's record shop was open forever and ever. I'm sure you bought your records there too. But anyway. It's a pretty neat place, that museum.
Mm-hmm. The Swamp Pop Museum
Yeah.
you're referring to? Yeah. I haven't had a chance to go, but
Yeah.
I'd like to. Any other questions?
There's
Oh,
also
yeah.
a museum that's not part of the current Floyd's record shop. There's a small museum that's with the retail place. Also.
Oh, okay.
I'm from Ville Platte also.
Okay.
Originally.
Any other questions? All right. Thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks.
Great.